Will block tariffs crush our budget even more? See what the numbers say. Hello, members, super savers, and bond course fans. I hope you're healthy and well. So, as many of you have heard me say in recent months, the only certainty we appear to have is that things are pretty uncertain. Here is the newest turn in our ongoing tariff saga that many of us woke up to this morning. A court just declared most of the president's Liberation Day tariffs invalid. As CNN reports, tariffs and Trump's entire economic agenda were just thrown into chaos. Is this the end of President Trump's tariffs, or just a setback that may not change the overall direction? And what impact, if any, might additional tariffs, or the lack thereof, have on the budget deficit? The latter appears to be a top-of-mind question for many in our Diamond Nest Egg community these days. So, here are the three topics that we'll be covering in today's video. 1. Are tariffs now really dead? And if not, will tariffs pay for our budget deficit? 2. What is the administration's strategy to stabilize the budget deficit after the proposed tax cuts? And 3. Will tariffs crush economic growth? As usual, here's our front of video disclaimer. For a detailed disclaimer, please refer to the end of this video. Let's dive in now, folks. Are tariffs now really dead? And if not, will tariffs pay for our budget deficit? So, the ruling against tariffs came from a little-known lower federal court in Manhattan. As CNBC reports, the U.S. Court of International Trade on Wednesday ruled that the president had overstepped his authority by invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to impose sweeping tariffs on numerous countries. And what happened is that this court blocked all the tariffs that the president had imposed by invoking the IEEPA, claiming that this act was really meant for true emergencies and not for enacting the tariff agenda of a new administration. Now, while this is clearly a setback for the administration, it does not necessarily mean that Trump's tariffs are now dead in the water, so to speak. Here are the three reasons why. First, the judges gave the Trump administration 10 days to comply with the ruling, and it appears that the Trump administration swiftly appealed the ruling. In our mind, the case will probably go to the Supreme Court for the final decision now, and we can't predict how this will go. Second, there may be several ways President Trump could work around the court's ruling by using different laws to impose the tariffs again. Investment bank Goldman Sachs put out a first research note overnight, and as Bloomberg reports, Goldman says Trump can offset tariff ruling with other tools. And third, even if both the appeals and the use of other laws fails, the administration might still ask Congress to enact a law that either imposes the new tariffs directly or explicitly gives the president the permission to do so. A lot is going on here, and we'll be following it closely here at Diamond Nest Egg and reporting back to all of you as usual. But realistically, we don't think that a single court ruling of a lower level court will fully derail the administration's tariff policy. We've seen this playbook way too often before, both with President Trump and other former presidents. The government gets sued all the time, and sometimes it wins and sometimes it loses. But the lower courts rarely decide the direction of the policy in the end. As we see it, this is checks and balances at work, just as the Constitution wants it. In other words, it's our opinion at the current time that tariffs will happen one way or the other. It's just a matter of when and how much. So, let's talk a bit about how much in additional tariffs our country has collected in its first month since Liberation Day. According to this recent Bloomberg article, U.S. importers paid a record $16.5 billion as April tariff bill lands. CNBC was even more optimistic, stating that the tariff receipts topping $16 billion in April were a record that helped cut the budget deficit. As we've just seen from these two articles, Trump's higher tariffs did indeed bring higher revenues for the Treasury, as one would have expected, which is welcoming news in a time when the new budget bill that's currently going through Congress is proposing an increase in our deficit by $3 trillion over the next 10 years. We walk through the numbers in detail in this latest video on President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, link below in the first pinned comment for your convenience. The thing is, even at first glance, it seems easy to see that $16 billion in additional monthly tariff revenue will not be enough to pay for our budget deficit, given how big it is. So let's run a thought experiment on how high tariffs would need to go in order to plug our fiscal deficit completely, and whether that looks like a realistic scenario. And let's use the numbers for the last full fiscal year of 2024, which should give us a more robust feeling for the dimensions of the problem. The current data from 2025 may just not be settled and stable enough yet, given that both tariff rates and import volumes have fluctuated wildly since the beginning of this year, as many in the industry have noted. So here's the data for the last full federal fiscal year, which ended on September 30th, 2024. We can see here that the federal government took in $4,919 billion, or a bit more than $4.9 trillion in revenues from all sources last year. These numbers include these $77 billion from customs duties, a somewhat meager-looking 1.6% of total revenues. And looking at the spending, we can see that the government spent $6,752 billion, or about $6.8 trillion in 2024, leaving us with a budget deficit of $1,833 billion, or $1.8 trillion. And as a side remark, despite all the recent volatility, the latest forecast for a budget deficit for the current fiscal year is very similar to last year at $1,878 billion, or a bit less than $1.9 trillion for 2025, compared to these $1,833 billion, or a bit more than $1.8 trillion from last year that we just discussed. So at least the budget deficit looks like it will stay almost stable this year in absolute numbers, which also means that it should be a somewhat comparable target for the tariff simulation that we're about to go through. So back to our thought experiment. How high would tariff rates have had to go for tariffs to plug this entire $1.8 trillion deficit in our federal budget for 2024? And how realistic would that have been? The Bureau of Economic Analysis reports that in fiscal year 2024, the U.S. imported goods worth $3,229 billion, or about $3.2 trillion. As we've already shown, the Treasury collected tariffs of $77 billion on this volume, equal to an average tariff rate of 2.4%. Now, if we wanted to raise the full $1.8 trillion to fill the budget gap, the U.S. would have had to impose average tariffs of 56.8% on all imported goods. In other words, if we apply a hypothetical average tariff rate of 56.8% on the $3.2 trillion of imported goods in fiscal year 2024, the Treasury would have collected $1.8 trillion in tariffs, and we would have had a balanced budget. Now, that does not sound very realistic to me for a host of reasons. First and foremost, tariffs that high would almost surely have substantially reduced the import volume, and as a consequence, the overall tariff take. Plus, a large part of our imports are either exempt from tariffs because we need these goods, or they're privileged under trade agreements like the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, or USMCA, as the former NAFTA is now called, that has survived Trump's new tariffs in its course so far, meaning that to get to an average tariff rate of 56.8% across all imports, we would need even higher rates on all the other imports that are not privileged. And as we've seen, peak rates of 145% of imports from China didn't last that long in real life during our current tariff saga. So it seems very unlikely that tariffs alone will be able to pay for our entire deficit. That said, at least in my mind, if we end up with somewhat pragmatic but still higher new tariff rates, it seems possible that higher tariffs could contribute a meaningful amount towards our budget. For example, a 10% average tariff, the base rate in Trump's new tax plan, might raise $320 billion a year on an import volume of $3.2 trillion, all else being equal, which would still be a not insignificant contribution. And a 10% average tariff would probably not bring global commerce to a complete standstill. That said, you can play a few scenarios in your head with lower or higher tariffs for yourself if you want. Average tariffs of, let's say, 15% or 20% might raise even more money, between $480 billion and $640 billion, respectively, and all else being equal. But keep in mind that the full impact of new tariffs on the economy and our budget is not linear and can be complex to forecast, and we'll only know for sure how they influence growth, employment, inflation, and many other factors when they're actually in place. So in this sense, we seem to be in the middle of a huge, real-time economic experiment right now. What do you think? What average tariff rate would you target? Back to the old average of 2.4%, or rather 10%, or maybe even more? And how would you fix the remaining budget deficit? Drop a comment below and let me and the community know. Now, given the tariffs alone will most likely not fix our budget deficit, and even less so if we consider the current draft budget with its additional tax cuts, let's move on to the next section of today's video. What is the administration's strategy to stabilize the budget deficit after the proposed tax cuts? As our Diamond Nest Egg regulars have heard us say often on this channel, the biggest problem with our debt is not that it's growing per se, because a growing country, especially one like ours, may well take on some debt to support that growth. The biggest problem with our debt is that it's growing faster than our GDP. And it seems Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent agrees. Here's an interview that he did on Fox News last Friday, where he shed some light on the administration's strategy for stabilizing the budget deficit after the proposed tax cuts.
So we think that we can both grow the economy and control the debt. And what's important, Bill, is that the economy grows faster than the debt.
And then Bessent confirms his conviction.
If we change the growth trajectory of the country, of the economy, then we will stabilize our finances and grow our way out of this.
Now, as we talked about in this recent video on President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill that I mentioned earlier, again, linked below in the first pinned comment for your convenience, according to the latest forecast from the Nonpartisan Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, or CRFB, the budget deficit could rise from about 6% of GDP currently to around 7% of GDP with the new tax cuts. So let's do another high-level thought experiment to see how the numbers would fall out under Bessent's scenario. In other words, under what assumptions would the economy grow fast enough to stabilize the budget deficit and grow us out of our debt? And let's use as a starting point the CRFB's projection, a 7% budget deficit. Now, let's deduct from this 7% all the factors that will mitigate the starting budget deficit, factors that will make this deficit look smaller over time if compared to our GDP. And we may compare this in a way to how a family might evaluate the burden of a mortgage to its household budget. Yes, the mortgage may look high compared to our income, but over time, we'll get some automatic pay rises with inflation, and maybe we get promoted and get some real salary increases as well. Plus, we will make a bit of money from a side gig or from savings elsewhere. So let's apply this chain of thought to our national household, so to speak, and start with the 7% budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. Step 1 is to deduct inflation, because this 7% CRFB projection is nominal, meaning it includes inflation. And let's assume a 2% inflation rate, which is based on the Fed's target inflation rate. Step 2 is to deduct the real rate of annual growth that we expect for the U.S. economy. And let's put in here something that we have already managed to achieve: the average real growth of our economy over the past 10 years of 2.34% after inflation. This is based on numbers from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And yes, it includes this blip here from COVID. And step 3 is to deduct our projected additional tariff income that is not included in the CRFB's projection. In our mind, at this point, it's probably unlikely that President Trump will back down completely on tariffs. So let's assume an average tariff rate of 10%, which all else being equal might bring in an additional $320 billion a year, as we discussed in the previous section of today's video. And also, as we mentioned earlier, we think this may not be an unlikely outcome despite yesterday's ruling from the lower level federal U.S. Court of International Trade. There are still several ways for the administration to implement their tariff agenda. That said, if you think there will be no new additional tariff revenue because of yesterday's ruling on Trump's tariffs, then please do adjust the numbers that we're going to go through based on your assumptions, as this will negatively impact the budget deficit. In any case, according to the government's own Congressional Budget Office's Budget and Economic Outlook 2025 to 2035, GDP for 2025 is projected to be around $30 trillion. So $320 billion in additional tariff revenue represents roughly 1% of GDP based on this CBO projection here. So this 1% here would reduce the CRFB's projected budget deficit as a percentage of GDP even further, so to speak. Now, this is just our assumption for the purposes of this little exercise here, and by no means guaranteed. But additional tariff revenue of $320 billion and the subsequent 1% reduction in budget deficit seems to us at least not impossible, given that we already saw $16 billion in tariffs in April alone. Finally, let's add together all the numbers here, and we get to an estimated remaining gap to stabilize the national debt as a percentage of GDP of 1.66%. What this means in the context of our scenario is that if our economy can grow an additional 1.66% or more above and beyond this 2.34% real rate of annual growth that we achieved over the past 10 years, then taken together with the expected inflation and the extra income from tariffs, our national debt would grow slower, or at least not faster than our GDP. Or as Besant would say, our economy would then grow as fast, or hopefully even a bit faster than our debt, and we could, over time, grow out of the problem. The question here is, can we get to this 1.66% of additional real economic growth, and how? Of course, there are many reasons for why we might not be able to get to the growth we would need, from geopolitical instability to a global recession. But given that we hear about these risk factors in the media all the time, my feeling is that I may not need to repeat them here. So let's take a somewhat less pessimistic perspective for this video and consider a few arguments on the upside that could be added to this analysis. First, more than $6 trillion in investment commitments to our country since President Trump took office again. This is made up of more than $2.1 trillion from private companies, including $500 billion each from Project Stargate, which includes SoftBank, OpenAI, and Oracle, as well as Apple and NVIDIA, plus another $4.2 trillion from foreign governments. If you're interested in more details, I've linked in the first comment below this video this running list from the official website of the White House. It's a fairly long list of private companies, as you can see here. And if we scroll all the way down, very large numbers have been committed by the UAE, Qatar, Japan, and Saudi Arabia as well. So let's see how much of this will actually happen and how much new employment and economic growth will come about as a result. But even if just some of it does come to fruition, that's still more than we had before. And keep in mind that all these commitments to invest in the U.S. were not made out of a good heart, but to stay friends and keep tariff-free access to the U.S. market. So there should be some incentive to make at least a part of these promises happen. Moving on now to the second factor that could contribute to closing this remaining gap of 1.66%, the government's efficiency drive from DOGE and across the departments. Now, I know that DOGE is unpopular in some circles, but financially speaking, the effort should help a bit with shrinking expenses and increasing efficiency across the government. As most fiscal experts, or anyone for that matter, who runs a business or household budget will tell you, cutting costs and implementing savings can be painful, especially in the short term. But savings Cost cutting is something that the folks who are in charge can directly control and relatively quickly in some instances, whereas tariffs and these upside factors here will always depend more on external factors as well as changes in the business cycle. Now, we were not able to find a definitive number for estimated government savings, as the estimates vary widely depending on which source you use. But when a country has $3 trillion in extra deficit coming its way, like ours does, every little bit in savings counts. And frankly speaking, as an investor in Treasuries in our nation's debt, I wish the budget would include more savings as well. Perhaps we'll see more concrete cost-cutting initiatives added to the draft bill as it progresses through Congress. Moving on now to the third factor that could contribute to closing this remaining gap of 1.66%, a renewed focus on efficiency, productivity, and meritocracy in our country. Personally, I just don't see a world where being more efficient, more productive, and more meritocratic would not lead to more economic growth. People and companies working smarter and harder and being properly rewarded for those efforts have been driving the economic success of our nation since it was founded, after all. Again, this point is hard to quantify, given that we are just at the very start of the process. So we'll hold off on the numbers here as well. But if we take these three factors here together that are working in favor of greater economic growth, this additional 1.66% gap, maybe it's not as much pie in the sky as one might imagine. That said, in real life, and when you dive into the details, there will be many more risks and other factors that may impact these high-level numbers here, and it could all end in a dangerous debt spiral. But if enough of the stars align, and we can close this estimated 1.66% gap, perhaps the best scenario of growing our economy faster than our debt and stabilizing the budget deficit may become more of a reality and less wishful thinking. Drop a comment below and let me and the community know, what do you think? Is our country headed towards greater economic growth with some occasional blips here and there? Or is it mostly wishful thinking and we're headed towards stagnation or even worse, a recession? Should we rely more on cost cutting and expense reduction than on growth alone? And for those of you who may fall into the stagnation and recession groups, as well as for those of you who are intellectually curious, let's move on now to the next section of today's video. Will tariffs crush economic growth? Many economists have been warning us, as Market Watch says here. Will Trump's tariffs push the U.S. economy into recession? Many economists think so. And of course, if the tariffs were to actually push the U.S. into a recession, that wouldn't really help with bringing our deficit under control. Quite the contrary. Treasury Secretary Bessent's plan to grow out of our deficit over time would remain just wishful thinking. As I always say, I don't have a crystal ball. And who knows? Anything can happen these days, right? Trade wars can have unintended consequences. But let's refresh our memories with an expert who we've discussed before on this channel, Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winner in economics and staunch critic of almost everything that has to do with President Trump. So back in 2016, when Trump was running for president the first time and already proposing high tariffs that many saw as pure protectionism that would cause a recession, Krugman, to almost everyone's surprise, wrote a piece in the New York Times in which he defended Trump against the charge that his tariffs would cause a recession. As he says, after all, doesn't everyone know that protectionism, tariffs, causes recessions? Actually, no. There are reasons to be against protectionism, but that's not one of them. And in a nutshell, Krugman's argument is that when tariffs make imports more expensive, people would simply switch to domestic products, increasing local demand and production. If imported cars become too expensive after tariffs, then maybe American cars look attractive again. Of course, there might be some disruptions during the transition, and inflation might go up, but there would most likely not be a sudden drop in overall demand from new tariffs. But on the contrary, we might actually see foreign investments, domestic manufacturing, and employment pick up, as we discussed in the previous section of this video. And if we look at some recent data points, they came in much better than many had feared. As S&P reports based on the latest data, output growth improves in May, but prices spike higher amid tariff impact. So more or less what Krugman predicted. More local production as businesses scramble to produce more of what they sell in America, but also higher inflation from the extra cost for the tariffs and from dealing with the short-term disruptions. And two more optimistic data points. According to the Transportation Security Administration, the TSA, Friday, May 23rd, the start of Memorial Day weekend, was the third busiest day ever at airports with over 3 million passengers. And U.S. consumer confidence jumped the most in 4 years on the recent trade truce with the European Union, per Bloomberg. So perhaps, if we're careful and a little bit lucky, the tariffs, along with these upside factors that we just covered, may bring in just enough extra revenue for the Treasury and give enough of a boost to domestic production and manufacturing without increasing inflation too much, so that the U.S. can, over time, stabilize its budget and grow out of the debt problem that we undoubtedly have. And maybe the government can even save a bit more on its expenses. It's still early days, though, and I'm sure that our tariff saga may go on for a while, and we may see more surprises and quick course corrections if the circumstances warrant them, if President Trump stays true to recent precedent. That said, for now, it appears that enough Americans are trying to carry on with their normal lives, and that tariffs haven't quite crushed the economy just yet. But who knows, right? What about you? Are you trying to carry on with your normal pre-tariff life? And do you think that tariffs will play a not insignificant role in helping with our budget deficit? Or do you fear that tariffs will crush our economy even after today's video? Drop a comment below and let me and the community know. Things can change pretty quickly these days, and that debt ceiling deadline is not too far off either. So let's see how things will develop in the coming weeks and months, and if our country gets closer to closing this budget deficit gap via greater economic growth or not. So as always, stay tuned. Interesting times seem ahead for us, our treasuries, and our country. All right, members, super savers, and bond course fans, I hope you enjoyed today's video and learned something new. And as always, if you want to take advantage of the current attractive bond rates, then check out this video here on our bond courses. Use coupon code BONDS2025 to get an additional 10% off of our popular bond course bundle before midnight Eastern Time on Saturday, May 31st. Prices won't be this low again, as we have some significant updates planned in the coming months. The 10% coupon code BONDS2025 can also be used to purchase bond beginners or bond masters individually. I've linked all the details on our bond courses and our YouTube Super Saver membership below this video for your convenience. And see you again very soon with more brand new wealth building content for your financial journey.